so I'll turn it over to you, Bob.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Doug said, my name is Bob Pfaff, and I work in the Budget and Strategic Planning Office at EMLA. So I thought to start, I'll give you a quick update on the budget. So FY16, our presidential request is $188.6 million. The Senate gave us a full mark, and the House decremented us down to 180. So what we are doing currently is we're planning to the low mark of 180, and then as in years past, we will go to NMED and negotiate our IPL, our Integrated Priority List, which you guys have input to, and we try to incorporate your recommendations. The other complication that we're having is, as people have talked, we're implementing a bridge contract with LANS. So we are currently negotiating that contract and the work scope associated with it. So that could potentially change the IPL depending on how the negotiations go. Once we get that in alignment, we'll go down to NMED and try and finalize the initial IPL. Now, hopefully, we'll get our full mark. If we get our full mark, we will add the additional $8.6 million in from the low 180 mark and execute $188.6 million worth of scope in FY16, hopefully.
Robert, I have a question, just because I've heard this term being brought up a few times now. What is the bridge contract?
Okay, the bridge contract is the Secretary of Energy has mandated us at Los Alamos to separate the EM work scope from the NNSA contract. The M&O contract currently has both the NNSA and the EM work scope under one contract. So we are separating out the EM work scope into an individual contract, and to bridge that gap, hence the bridge contract, we're going to work with LANS for the next couple of years till we get all of those contracts in place. So basically it's a EM separate contract with LANS to execute the environmental cleanup work scope at Los Alamos. And Christine, I think, is going to talk a little bit more about that in her time. Any other questions on the budget, Carlos?
Thanks, Bob. What does the 15 budget look like? Do you have just a ballpark number?
The 15 budget was 188.6, so same.
Okay, so in the event of sequestration, we're not looking at any kind of different number that we have to start operating October 1st with?
Okay, so thank you for that. So here's how sequestration works. As you might recall, 2 years ago is when sequestration first was vetted by our congressmen and senators. And it was a 2-year period. That 2-year period expires September 30th of this year. So if Congress or the Senate Appropriation Committees don't do anything, per se, with the budget, sequestration re-invokes October 1st. So we're hoping that, they deal with that issue and we don't have sequestration, but, we don't know at this point.
Okay, so what are the chances, I should say, the odds, the possibilities of come October 1st, we don't have a budget and we start operating on continued resolution? Does that number go back to 14 numbers, 15 numbers?
It depends on the language that they come up with. If they, I'll use the technical term, if they punt and don't do anything and don't put language in the CR, it would revert back to the sequestration numbers, but we're all hoping that that doesn't happen.
Worst case scenario is 180.
Not necessarily, because the worst case scenario potentially could be they would take the low mark and put whatever sequestration factor on, which, you know, for us, last time I think was like 7% roughly in aggregate. So it could be lower than 180 if sequestration pops in, potentially.
I'm hearing that bridge contract won't start till 17, so none of these 16 numbers contain funding for bridge.
Okay, I'll bail you out.
Christine will answer
May
that
I?
one.
Okay,
Yes,
this is a carefully
absolutely.
orchestrated handoff. So we're in the process of negotiations with LANs right now. We asked them to give us an estimate for a period of performance that would go for fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 17 to perform a very specific scope of work. You heard Dave Nicholas talk about the nitrate treatment, and then there's a certain amount of soil and groundwater remediation work that we've asked LANs to price. We're negotiating with them right now. We have a team back in Cincinnati working on it. And our hope is that we reach a contract that would have us having our direct contract with LANs for fiscal year 16 and 17. And these funding levels are, would support the planned activities that we have there. The goal is to have new competitively awarded contracts be awarded in 17 to become effective no later than the start of fiscal year 18. So the bridge period would be about 1 to 2 years, 16 and 17. And again, it's bridging the time required for us to do the competitive acquisition to award new EM cleanup contracts for future cleanup scope beyond this initial 2-year period. So the funding levels we're talking about for 16 would, we hope, be executed under a bridge contract with LANs. If we're unsuccessful in getting there, we'll continue to use the M&O relationship and work through NALA to have LANs perform the EM-funded scope much as they've been doing forever, as long as EM's been doing cleanup work at LANL. Does that answer your question? Okay. We can follow up later, okay? Thanks.
Okay, any other questions on the budget before I kind of transition to planning? Okay, so planning. So what have we been doing in planning lately at Los Alamos? We've had some dynamic factors that we've kind of talked about some of them. One, the bridge contract. Two, a different acquisition strategy that will be implemented after the bridge contract. And then, of course, any OMB or congressional actions that are taking place. So what we've done as a federal team is we've put together a federal life cycle estimate of the remaining work scope for the environmental cleanup efforts at Los Alamos. And we've procured the services of the CBC, the EM CBC, which is our business center for EM. And specifically, we use their cost estimators, because they have experts in that field, to put together a life cycle baseline based on, well, we don't know what the acquisition strategy will be. I'm sure Christine will talk about that, but there's some various options that are being floated at headquarters right now for approval. And I want to make this point. All of the new emergent scope that we know of is in this federal life cycle baseline. And what I mean by that is the scope categories include, for example, chromium, aggregate areas, and above ground true. There's many others that I'll go through in a minute in detail. But as far as we know, we have captured all of the known scope to complete the environmental cleanup efforts at Los Alamos. Carlos?
Sorry to be such a pain, Bob, but we had a consent order that expires at the end of this year.
Right, December of 15.
And now we have, I'm guessing, a whole brand-new federal team to come up with a new federal life cycle estimate to clean up legacy. Well, where does that leave the consent order? Does that kind of let it die off? I mean, are we going to take it under consideration? I guess I'm looking at NMED to, can you help me out here?
Yes, I can, Carlos, actually. So I am actually going to talk about that in my brief presentation when we go through, but to touch on where we are in terms of consent order negotiations. So I will be able to answer probably a lot of that.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll defer that one for a little bit. Good question, though. So this life cycle estimate tool that we have will continue to be refined. And what I mean by that is once we get the acquisition strategy in place. We'll break the work up in that associated acquisition strategy. Once the bridge contract is negotiated, if we have to do any change control, we will implement that in this tool. And this tool will be used to inform our regulator and our acquisition plans as well. And I know the question's coming, so I'll answer it before it's asked. Yes, you guys will get a chance to look at this when the time is right. The cap, I mean. Okay, so what were some of our planning considerations? I kind of went over this already. Any OMB and congressional decisions. This includes headquarters direction as well that we get. There is a strategic planning team for EM for all of the sites. Los Alamos is represented, as well as Jenna Hackett, who is another member of our team, are on that strategic planning team. A little side note, I mean, we are very sorry to see Christine go, but the new person coming on is on the strategic planning team, so he already has a leg up on what's happening at Los Alamos. I'll leave the rest of it for you. Talked earlier about this. The bridge contract negotiations also will have an impact on this, and then regulatory decisions. Obviously, we're going to have to go to NMED and rework the consent order, and I'll let Katie talk about that later. But it's not only for 16 and 17, it's 18 and beyond. So we have this thing planned out to completion based on what we think the priorities are. And again, we'll have to negotiate those with NMED, as well as we'll let you guys take a look at it and give you recommendations on that hopefully soon. Okay, so let's talk about some of the work that we're doing now. Dave pretty much hit on this in his presentation, but the two priorities that we're working right now in our true waste area are the safe storage of the above-grade wasted area G and the nitrate salts. Those are our priority, as well as the corrective action plans from the AIB report. So that's kind of what's going on in our true waste area. What we're doing right now in our soil and water, and this is the consent order work, if you will. The true waste is technically not in the consent order. It's in the framework agreement, but it's not in the consent order. Our highest priority, at least from a DOE perspective, is the chromium plume control and characterization. And as you know, that's the chromium that's heading towards the Sanai boundary. And I believe we put one well in the Sanai boundary. Is that correct, Craig?
We're putting if I may?
Yes.
We are in the process of putting in a monitoring well on Sanai property, yes.
So this is a first at Los Alamos to actually put a well on non-lab property. This is Sanai property. So we've worked out an access agreement with Sanai to do this, and we've also, obviously worked with the regulator to inform them what we're doing in this arena.
Robert, do you expect that well to be in place by the end of the year?
Yes.
Okay, then the next project, and this is one that you guys, I think Lee mentioned it earlier, there's a tour of TA-16. This you can get an up-close and personal look, if you will, of the RDX investigation. And that's, we're investigating a distribution of contaminants in the regions up there. And the potential solutions, these are deep aquifer wells. So we'll be putting wells up there at some point in time, or additional wells. Okay, the next one is kind of a success story, if you will, and that's the town sites. That's, Carlos?
In terms of the TA-16, isn't that where they did bomb testing or major burns.
Yes.
What about TA 49? Didn't they do similar activity in 49? Are we addressing 49 at all?
I'll let Craig answer that one. This is Craig Douglas, by the way, from LANS. He's one of the managers in the soil and water area.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I will introduce myself. Craig Douglas, I am the division leader for the environmental remediation program. The soil and water portion of work comes under my purview. So the answer to your question is TA 49 is where MDA-AB, which I think Bob is going to talk briefly about the number of MDAs that we do still, material disposal areas that we do still have to address. And it is adjacent to the TA 16 RDX work.
Okay, so the town sites, and what we mean by town sites are those are geographical areas within the Los Alamos County boundaries. We've cleaned up over 100 of these. Some had minor remedies, some had more major ones, and we only have 13 remaining. So we are getting pretty close to giving all of the land back to Los Alamos County in the various town sites. So that's a good news story. Okay, aggregate areas, these are pretty much the same as town sites, except they're on lab boundaries, not Los Alamos County boundaries. So we're going to do soil investigations there. Okay, the airport landfill, the Los Alamos Airport, if you're familiar where that is, we need to put a RCRA cover on there because the current one is not performing. That project is actually started. That is a DOE federally funded project, and we are hoping to finish that project in FY16. Okay, the next.
Robert, when you say it's not performing effectively, what was it? Just a clay cover, or what was there that didn't adequately perform?
You know, do you know, Craig?
No, unfortunately.
Bob, if I may.
Go ahead.
I work closely with the airport manager of this landfill, and what was happening was it was actually subsiding quite a bit. The landfill wasn't maintaining its grade that it's supposed to. So actually, I think NNMCAB kicked back their plan for covering that landfill, and they have to go back to the drawing board. So.
Okay. Next group of work is the stormwater controls under IP, and I want to make a distinction here. IP is the individual permit, and that goes through the EPA regulator. We work very closely with NMED on this to inform them what we're doing, but this is under the EPA regulation umbrella. So we actually have two regulators for the environmental cleanup work at Los Alamos. And then next is the demolition of TA 21, the balance of plant facilities. This, unfortunately, because of budget constraints, is a lower priority. We would love to knock this off and get it done, but chromium and compliance work and the nitrate salts are a higher priority. So unless we can get some additional budget, this will get probably, we won't complete it this year and probably not even next year. All right, so now we're going to move to remaining work scope that isn't in the next couple of years necessarily. So in our true waste area, we're going to complete the above grade true disposition. And by that I mean we're going to have safe storage and processing of the above grade waste at area G. Next group is the below grade transuranic waste retrievals, and this includes the corrugated metal pipes, pit 9, and trenches A through D. And finally, we have the 33 shafts. And the 33 shafts, what we're doing right now is we have a separate federal contract with a company called Neptune And we're working a NEPA analysis to determine what the final remedy will be. Well, let me rephrase that. What our recommended final remedy will be, and then we'll go to NMED and pitch that, and hopefully they'll sign off on our agreed upon remedy.
What, Robert, when do you expect that?
I would
Recommended
say,
remedy?
I would say it's going to take probably a couple years, would be my guess, to get all that put together.
Okay. So we're looking at 2017?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is the NEPA review for this area currently underway?
I'm going to let Mr. Dave back there answer that one.
Just a little clarification on what Bob's talking about. So the NEPA review is not underway on the 33 shafts, hasn't started. The work that Neptune is working on will be a feeder into a potential future NEPA analysis, but there is no current NEPA analysis underway on the 33 shafts. So I think that's many years out from even being started.
Robert, but under the current budget, then you are putting some money into studying what to do with the
Yes.
33 shafts?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Or the waste of the 33
Yes.
shafts? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and go ahead.
Some of these things that are further out have been discussed earlier, and the level of funding we're talking about to deal with these is a big step up from where we are now. Or maybe a big step up from where we are now. You know,
Well,
How do you go
we've,
about-
all I can tell you right now, unfortunately, I can't really get into specifics because of the sensitivity of the information, because it's embargoed. We've put together a plan that headquarters has directed us at a funding target, and we've just laid out the work until we're done at that funding target. I really, I wish I could get more into specifics, but I really can't.
but does that mean if something exceeds the funding target, it'll either go very, very slowly, or it'll
Well-
just get put off forever?
Obviously, the more money we get, the faster we can do it.
If I could just intercede a little bit here, and I think maybe Katie will talk to this a little bit as well when she talks about the agency's vision for the consent order renegotiation. But there's a certain amount of, certainly funding constrains how much activity you can do in a given year, but there's also a practical sequence of work where it's impractical for us, even if we had all of the money we could ever want, we can't do everything simultaneously. Things have to be done in a certain order. So what this life cycle planning exercise is doing is attempting to lay out all of the work scope we know must be performed, both to satisfy consent order as well as individual permit requirements, and to do all the things that aren't driven clearly by external regulation but have to be done before areas are available for that sort of final remediation. All of that's being planned, and how long that schedule is a function of how you resource it. And so we can build a tool that is dynamic enough that we can use it to inform what the different scenarios would be if you had more money or less money, and what that would mean. And hopefully that tool, if well developed, will be really useful to the agency, to EM headquarters, my office when I'm back in DC, to make decisions about how good of an investment LANL cleanup project is in terms of reducing the life cycle cost and schedule. So Bob cannot talk to you about the details of our initial planning assumptions, but I can assure you that we're trying to identify and accommodate all of the scope within this tool so we can run various models based on certain funding levels and figure out what it means. But we can't, and it's not prudent for us to try and do a little bit of everything simultaneously. It's best to take on the higher risk, higher cost activities so that you get them done sooner and have more resources to do more things in parallel in out years, if that makes sense. That's just kind of our core project management approach to things. Okay, thank you.
But we have put together some impact analysis on what we put together, and with Christine going back to headquarters, now we have another advocate, right? Put you on the spot there. Okay. I think I'm on the MDAs. So the MDAs and the ones in parentheses, the alphas refer to the various areas of the MDAs, or material disposal areas. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong slide.
There you go.
So the MDAs is kind of a combination of things. We do surface water sampling to determine what waste is where and what's buried where. And then we also use deep aquifer wells to determine if the waste has any potential impacts. So we kind of use both approaches here with the MDAs. Right now, our preferred approach would be to cap these, but we have to do the various studies and give NMED the various data to support those caps. But I will tell you that we had to assume certain remedies when we put our life cycle estimate together, and the remedies that we assumed for MDAs were caps. So if it turns out to be something different, we'll have to modify our estimates, obviously. Sure.
I had a follow-up on the previous question. So when is it permissible for you to discuss the budget priorities or requests in more detail? Is it after the next fiscal year budget comes out in October, or some other time, or after negotiations with the state, or what?
You're talking the life cycle, right? The whole thing?
Yeah, and what you were telling us was
Okay.
embargoed. Sorry.
Okay.
And
well,
what you were telling us was embargoed and that
Okay.
you couldn't discuss at
Okay.
this point.
Fair enough. So what we're doing now is we're finalizing our cost estimates. We've had the various staff at EMLA look through what we call basis of estimates. That's the assumptions of how we put the estimates together. We've incorporated the comments, sent them back to our CBC, who has done all these estimates for us because they're the experts in the field. They're incorporating all the comments. Once we get all those put together, we'll do a final review with Christine. And then we'll have to vet that with headquarters, and at that point, hopefully they would give us approval to go over the data with you. So I would say, I mean, I know you're looking for a time frame. I would say hopefully within 3 months, maybe. Okay. We also have some aggregate areas that we need to finish. And again, aggregate areas are the non-town site geographic areas that we have to clean up. We have many of those in progress. The only ones we really haven't started are on the southern end, and those are about 10. And as funding is available, we can start those. And that's I don't know, it's hard to see, but a picture of MDAL. Okay, then finally, because Lee tells me I only have a couple minutes, we have our D&D activities, our deactivation and decommissioning. So we need to put facilities back in safe condition, remove the contaminants, and in some cases demolish the buildings and the waste. And we have 3 areas left to D&D. That's TA21, MDAL, and MDAG. MDAG is the trailing one. We can't really start that till Dave finishes his true waste activities. So MDAG will kind of be, you know, the last hole in the tent, if you will. And then what we do, since we are a completion project, we're actually supposed to finish the environmental cleanup work. We have a 3-year monitoring period. That's the agreement we have with NNSA right now. To make sure everything goes, you know, according to the way we thought it would. And then we essentially hand the keys over to NNSA, and we're done. The EM work scope would be done at that point. Carlos?
Thanks. In terms of the MDAG and the 33 shafts, wasn't a CME done already and submitted to NMED?
Yes, it was.
It was? And so wasn't part of that remediation to cap and cover? And so why are we hiring a whole brand-new company now to go and looks to me like a whole brand-new EIS.
All right, be my guest.
Yeah, I mean, the current NEPA assumptions in the site-wide NEPA look at removing the material in the 33 shafts. And the question is, given you have Area G, a lot of people are familiar with the true waste work that we do out there, but the entire area is a historic and has been operated as a low-level waste disposal area. And so the question is, if you're going to leave that radioactive material potentially in all of Area G, what's the incremental risk, if you will, of leaving the 33 shafts in place versus, you know, kind of a cost benefit of what it would take to remove that waste from those 33 shafts. So, so that's the piece that the company Neptune is kind of currently looking at, is what they do, basically long-term contaminant fate transport modeling. So they look at what would happen to these materials over substantial periods of time. And so that's the technical piece that they're looking at. So hopefully that answers you.
Well, Neptune, and correct me if I misunderstood you, but is going to look at it from a cost benefit?
No,
No.
no, they're not. They're looking at it purely from a technical perspective. Ultimately, the NEPA process will, and the process that we go through will look at, you know, the broader implications, but they are simply looking at the technical piece of what would happen if you were to, for instance, leave that material in place versus removing it, and what would be the long-term risk.
So risk is included in that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, well, that's good to know, because there's a, as far as I understand, a reactor at the bottom of that, one of those pipes?
So there is a, that's correct, one of the 33 shafts, and if you go back into the late 60s, when, anyway, there was a deep space reactor. It's called the Lamprey. It's not a very big thing, but it stands for Los Alamos Molten Plutonium Reactor Experiment. And the purpose of it was to look at a reactor that could go off into deep space and explore deep space. So in terms, technically it is a reactor, but it's a very, it's what is left of a reactor. So it's the shell of this experimental reactor, and it is in one of the shafts, and a relatively small piece, but you're correct.
Excuse me, Dave, do you feel like that there'll be an EIS done on the 33 shafts? And,
So-
in order to get this work, before this work is done?
I wouldn't say an EIS, maybe environmental assessment. There will be a NEPA decision document that will have to be done to evaluate whether or not the 33 shafts could be left in place or could be left at Area G.
And that,
So
of
there
course, will be reviewed by NMED, but it would also become a public information document?
Correct. I mean, the NEPA process is a public process. Part of that process involves public comment. So it's not, certainly NMED as an interested party can offer comment, but it's really a federal process that looks at any major federal action. If you were building a dam, roads, highways, a lot of that kind of stuff goes through the same National Environmental Policy Act to look at what the environmental impacts are of a proposed federal action. So and DOE, just like any other federal agency, administers a NEPA process. And so that would have to go through that NEPA review.
This is a follow-up on Carlos's question, I think. There was I think it's a corrective measures evaluation for Area G that was very comprehensive for all the underground waste. This is my understanding, went to the state, we sent it back at least once, if not twice, with comments about it. And so my question is, what's happened to that, and where does that fit into this overall planning process?
That is an excellent question. And I know it's actually a very hot topic for this board for several reasons. So the corrective measures evaluation for MDAG actually went through 3 revisions. The last revision was submitted to NNMCAB in the fall of 2011, I believe. So as everyone knows, there was a very great shift in work up at the laboratory. Hence, the framework agreement came out in 2012, and the shift was to get the true waste off of the Hill. That was one of Governor Martinez's big priorities because it was a high risk, especially in light of the Las Conchas fire. So that work was effectively put on hold to allow for that to happen. Now, and I'm going to get to this actually when I give my short brief about consent order and where we are, all of that will be factored into the consent order revision and what's going to have to happen. But I think it's also really important. Dave mentioned this actually when he got up, but the NEPA process, and especially for the 33 shafts, I know there are a lot of people who are not very happy about the fact that NNMCAB does not regulate radioactive waste, but that is the fact of the matter. We do not regulate radioactive waste. The problem, and clearly one of the complications of Area G, is that you have both. You have hazardous and you have radioactive. And so the final remedy that is selected for Area G will have to accommodate both of those things. But NNMCAB and from the department's perspective, we're only looking at a remedy that's going to address the hazardous components. But I will say, having actually worked at Los Alamos as well, that the requirements that DOE has to follow in terms of dealing with the radioactive components have to be as stringent, and in a lot of cases more stringent than even what RECRA would require.